right now, you are standing in the middle of a sudden, overwhelming flood.
And, well, it isn't water.
No, definitely not water. It is artificial intelligence, and it is pouring into our schools, our workplaces, and just our daily routines.
Absolutely. Every time you open a browser, read an article, or look at a syllabus, there's a new tool promising to change absolutely everything.
Right, and everyone is talking about the sheer volume of this technology, but almost no one is pausing to ask what this flood is actually washing away.
Or who is being left stranded.
Exactly. And before we really get into that, I want to quickly mention that you are experiencing a unique two-voice AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. And this is presented by MindfulMoments. Nourish your mind on the go.
Because it really is a flood that demands our immediate attention. Asking those uncomfortable questions about who gets left behind is exactly what we are here to do today.
So today, we're focusing on a really fascinating nonfiction book published in 2024 by Lanier Learning. It's called The Promises and Perils of AI in Education. Ethics and Equity have entered the chat.
Written by Ken Shelton and Dee Lanier, both of whom are longtime advocates for educational technology and equity.
Right. Now, instead of just giving you a basic summary where we list off the chapters, we are structuring this podcast as an essential insights analysis.
Which means we are pulling out the core takeaways. We're exploring what the book actually argues, examining how strong those arguments truly are.
And figuring out how these ideas apply directly to your daily life, whether you are sitting in a classroom, leading a school board, or just navigating our increasingly automated world.
To really grasp why Shelton and Lanier's argument matters so much, we first need to look at the broader cultural narrative surrounding artificial intelligence right now.
Right, the usual conversation.
Yeah, because typically when people discuss this technology in education, they fall into two incredibly polarized camps.
It really feels like there is zero middle ground. On one side, you have the productivity miracle camp.
Oh, yes. The tech enthusiasts.
Exactly. These are the voices often coming from Silicon Valley or, just really eager educators who see this as the ultimate solution to all our educational woes. They highlight extreme efficiency.
They promise tools that will instantly grade 50 essays.
In 3 seconds, yeah. Or generate endless lesson plans and act as a personalized, flawless tutor for every single student in the room.
They view the technology as this inherent good that just needs to be unleashed.
All right. And then on the completely opposite end of the spectrum, you have the cheating menace camp.
The panic camp.
The panic camp, exactly. This view sees the technology strictly as a threat to academic integrity. The conversation here focuses entirely on, fear. It's about the death of the high school essay, how educators must aggressively police student behavior, lock down browsers.
Invest in detection software to catch plagiarists. It treats the technology as a hostile invader that has to be contained.
But reading through Shelton and Lanier's book, they completely reject both of those extremes.
They do. Their central thesis here is that artificial intelligence is neither a magical miracle nor a malicious menace.
Right, it's something else entirely.
Instead, they argue that it is a powerful amplifier.
I really want to focus on that concept of the amplifier because it's the cornerstone of their entire framework.
It is. The technology simply takes whatever practices are already in place within a system and, it turns the volume up to maximum.
So if a school or workplace has robust, inclusive practices, the tools can amplify that inclusion.
Exactly. But on the flip side, if a system is already struggling with inequity,
like if there are biases in how students are disciplined or how resources are allocated.
Right, if those flaws exist, the technology will magnify those existing flaws at a terrifying speed.
Let's make that concrete, because amplifier is a great concept, but I want to ensure we really understand how it functions. Because, typical books covering educational technology might throw in a single chapter on equity as an afterthought.
Yeah, like a sidebar.
Like a sidebar to the main discussion about all the exciting new software features. But Shelton and Lanier, they make ethics, bias, and power structures the absolute center of their entire conversation. It's not a side chapter. It is the whole book.
And they managed to do that without making the book sound overly pessimistic, which is impressive.
Yeah, how do they do that?
Well, they achieve a very intentional balance. The authors are highly critical of the flawed systems currently in place, but they remain fundamentally hopeful about the people working within those systems.
They refuse to assign moral goodness or badness to the software itself.
Precisely. By doing that, they place the moral responsibility right back on the humans adopting it. They frame the adoption of artificial intelligence not merely as a technical upgrade.
Like installing faster Wi-Fi or buying new laptop.
Right. They frame it as an urgent ethical and justice question.
And that brings us to a concept the book explores deeply, moving us from the general idea of an amplifier to what exactly is being amplified. The authors spend a lot of time talking about what they call the mirror effect.
The mirror effect. Yeah, this is their warning about our current reality. If you look at our educational systems today, access, consent, and representation are frequently unjust.
For sure.
Certain demographics have significantly less access to rigorous coursework like advanced placement classes. Their data privacy is often compromised without meaningful consent from their families.
And their histories and cultures are underrepresented in the standard curriculum.
Exactly. And the book argues that if we just blindly layer artificial intelligence over these existing realities, we'll simply automate that injustice at an unprecedented scale.
The technology acts as a mirror.
It reflects our structural inequities right back at us, but, making them look like objective, machine-driven truths.
I think we need a better metaphor here to really understand the mechanism of how this works. Think of artificial intelligence in education not as a magical, independent brain making fresh decisions.
Right. It isn't a blank slate.
Exactly. Instead, think of it as a massive autocomplete feature, kind of similar to what you have on your phone's keyboard.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
So if the societal sentence you usually type is full of bias, historical segregation, and unequal funding,
the technology is just going to auto-complete the rest of that inequity.
right. The autocomplete analogy captures the mechanism perfectly.
Because predictive algorithms work by analyzing massive sets of historical data to guess what should come next. Let's walk through a hypothetical scenario to see the math of that bias in action.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a school district's historical data shows that students from a specific zip code historically get lower test scores. Now, we know that might be because that zip code has underfunded schools, larger class sizes, or fewer experienced teachers.
But the algorithm doesn't know about property taxes or systemic neglect.
Exactly. The algorithm just looks at the math and assumes that specific zip code equals low academic potential.
Wow. So when a new student from that exact zip code logs into a brand new, extremely expensive AI tutoring program, the system has already judged them based on the autocomplete data.
Yes, it might automatically steer them toward basic, repetitive drills instead of offering them advanced problem-solving challenges.
Just because it predicted they wouldn't be able to handle it.
Right. The machine isn't intentionally malicious. It is just repeating the biased sentence it was fed.
Which is why Shelton and Lanier are so meticulous about the specific language they use in the book. This really stood out to me as a critical insight into how we might fix the data we feed these machines.
They are very conscious of their words. They consciously avoid traditional educational labels that blame the individual.
Right, I noticed that. Instead of labeling a student as underperforming, the authors consistently use the term under-resourced, or conversely, appropriately resourced.
And while at first glance that just sounds like academic wordplay.
Yeah, just shifting terms around.
But it actually completely changes how you approach the problem, because language dictates our problem-solving approach. When you call a student underperforming, you locate the failure entirely within the child.
You imply that the student simply needs to work harder, or perhaps requires a technological intervention to fix their personal deficit.
But when you label a student as under-resourced, you immediately shift the focus away from the child and onto the systemic root causes.
You're now looking at the school's budget. You're looking at funding disparities, racial discrimination, a lack of support staff for disabilities, or missing language accommodations.
Exactly. If our historical data labels students as underperforming, the algorithm encodes that bias and continuously predicts failure for those demographics.
But by changing the language to focus on resources, we change the data we value.
We tell the system to flag the school's lack of funding, rather than flagging the student's lack of ability. It is a vital step to prevent the technology from automating blame.
Okay, so if the machine is currently set up to just automate our blind spots, we have to talk about how we fight back. The book says that to prevent these cracks in the foundation from widening, educators need to become AI activists and co-designers of these tools.
Yes, that is their main call to action.
And I have to push back here on behalf of the listener, because the reality on the ground in schools is intense. Teachers and administrators are drowning right now.
They are overwhelmed, without a doubt.
They're managing behavioral crises, navigating severe budget cuts, sitting through endless meetings, and trying to meet impossible testing standards. Is it truly realistic for this book to demand that these exhausted professionals also become activists and co-designers of complex software they didn't even invent?
It is an incredibly demanding proposition, and the authors, to their credit, acknowledge that fatigue. But they reframe the situation to explain why it is an absolute necessity, not just an optional extra duty. Because adopting artificial intelligence is not just another standard technology integration initiative. It is not like learning how to use a new digital grade book or a smartboard. It is a civic and moral practice.
Meaning, deciding whether to use a specific software program isn't just an IT department decision anymore, it's a moral decision.
Exactly.
It's like deciding whether to let a stranger monitor your students through a two-way mirror.
That is the exact level of seriousness the authors apply. These tools have the power to engage in mass surveillance of student behavior. They track eye movements, keystrokes, and emotional states.
That is terrifying when you put it like that.
And they have the power to rapidly widen achievement gaps by personalizing learning only for the appropriately resourced students while leaving the under-resourced students stuck in automated remediation loops.
So because the stakes are that high, stepping back is just not an option.
Right. The book argues that failing to act as a co-designer, just accepting whatever the vendor hands you, is a passive endorsement of whatever biases the software contains.
So being an activist in this context doesn't necessarily mean taking a weekend boot camp to learn how to write Python code.
No, not at all.
It means self-defense. It means asking the vendor representatives hard, uncomfortable questions before signing a contract.
It means exercising agency. An AI activist asks, where did the data to train this model come from? Who owns the intellectual property my students generate when they use this tool? Who was left out of the testing phase?
Real, substantial questions.
It means demanding transparency about data privacy and having the courage to refuse to implement a tool if the company cannot prove it protects student consent. The authors want to use artificial intelligence to democratize knowledge. They want genuinely personalized learning experiences. But they insist this is impossible without explicit, ongoing ethics work by the people physically in the room with the students.
This brings us to a really interesting philosophical layer of the book. Several reviewers have described Shelton and Lanier's work as near philosophical and highly radical.
Radical is a strong word.
It is. When we hear the word radical today, we usually think of something extreme or fringe.
The book is radical, but we should use that word in its literal original sense. The word radical comes from the Latin word radix, which means root.
To go to the root.
Exactly. To be radical is to go directly to the root of a problem, rather than just trimming the leaves at the surface.
So instead of getting distracted by the flashy leaves, like how fast a chatbot can write a sonnet, the authors are looking at the root causes of educational inequity. They are looking at who holds the data power.
They recognize that any conversation about artificial intelligence is fundamentally a conversation about power. Who gets to define what intelligence looks like?
Whose cultural knowledge is considered the default professional standard by the algorithm.
And whose knowledge is flagged as anomalous, inappropriate, or incorrect. By going to the root, the book challenges the reader to examine how society distributes power through data.
This connects directly to your daily life, even if you are not a teacher, a student, or a parent right now. Understanding data power and how bias is silently encoded into everyday practices affects every single one of us.
It absolutely does.
It dictates how you navigate the internet. It controls the targeted media and news you consume. It powers the algorithms that decide whether your resume is actually seen by a human resources manager or whether your loan application gets approved.
The critical questioning the authors demand for the classroom is the exact same critical questioning we need to apply to our digital lives everywhere.
The skills required to be an AI activist in a school are the identical skills required to be a responsible digital citizen in the world today.
You must constantly ask, who benefits from this automation? And who is harmed by its efficiency?
Let's transition into some practical application. We have covered heavy, complex concepts regarding ethics, the mirror effect, the autocomplete nature of bias, and the need to go to the root of data power. How can you take these ideas and discuss them fairly with others?
It's a great question.
Let's say you find yourself in a scenario where you have to debate these concepts with someone who vehemently disagrees with you.
The best way to understand a strong argument is to model a fair debate around it. If you are discussing this book's premise, you must first acknowledge the typical opposing view in its strongest form.
Give them the benefit of the doubt.
Right. You might say, look, vendors promise incredible efficiency and personalized learning pathways. There is a very strong argument that these tools could save teachers countless hours of preparation time, allowing them to finally focus more on direct human interaction with their students.
That is a completely valid point, and, it appeals to anyone who feels overwhelmed by their workload, but then you bring in the reality check from Shelton and Lanier's perspective.
You would counter by focusing on the danger of unexamined speed. You could say, however, efficiency without a rigorous ethical framework is dangerous. It just speeds up the marginalization of already vulnerable students.
Because if an algorithm efficiently tracks students into lower-tier learning pathways based on biased historical data, then that efficiency is actively causing harm.
We are just doing the wrong things much faster.
Imagine you are actually at a local school board meeting. A board member feels immense pressure from the community to just buy a highly publicized, very expensive artificial intelligence program so the district appears innovative and modern on their website.
They just want to sign the contract, send out a press release, and be done with it.
Exactly. You don't need to quote this book verbatim or use heavy academic jargon. You can just ask them directly. Are we buying this to actually help our students or just to look innovative? Because if we buy it without checking its biases, we aren't innovating. We are just automating our blind spots.
That kind of framing changes the entire dynamic of the room. You elevate the discussion from a mere budget line item to a critical examination of the district's core values.
You force the decision makers to pause and consider the human impact of their technological investments rather than just the financial cost.
It is a powerful way to use the book's framework.
We have covered tremendous ground today in this podcast. We started by looking at the polarized narrative of miracles versus menaces and discovered how Shelton and Lanier position this technology as a powerful amplifier of our existing practices, for better or for worse.
We explored the mirror effect, using the autocomplete analogy to understand how predictive algorithms threaten to automate injustice at scale if we ignore the cracks in our societal foundation.
We also examined the absolute necessity of shifting our language. We discussed the power of moving away from labeling students as underperforming to recognizing them as under-resourced.
Which forces us to focus on systemic failures rather than assigning individual blame to the child.
And most importantly, we discussed the book's radical call to action. We moved from viewing artificial intelligence as a mere technological upgrade like buying new hardware to recognizing it as a profound civic and moral practice.
This requires us to step out of our comfort zones, stop being passive consumers of whatever software is handed to us, and become active co-designers and advocates to protect our most vulnerable populations.
As we conclude this essential insights analysis, we want to leave you with 3 specific, open questions to carry with you. Take these questions into your classrooms, your boardrooms, or your dinner table conversations tonight.
First, look at the digital tools you use every single day. Who were those tools originally designed for, and who might they be silently leaving out of the equation?
Number 2, if artificial intelligence is truly a mirror reflecting our existing systems, what does the reflection in your own school, your own workplace, or your own community look like right now? If the system auto-completes your community's data, what sentence does it write?
And finally, how can you step out of the role of a passive consumer of technology and become an active advocate for fairness and justice in your own digital life?
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth analysis. Keep questioning the foundation beneath the technology, and as always, keep nourishing your mind on the go with Mindful Moments.